released someone with an extraordinary talent to optimizing words so that each of his sentences vibrates with the interplay of syntax and phonics. A man of many hats and tremendous talent, Geoffrey O'Brien is a poet, translator, former editor-in-chief, critic, professor, and cultural historian. Language functions as his playground, and he combines the poet's aesthetic, the incisiveness of an analyst, and the meticulousness of a detective. O'Brien's critiques always operate on multiple modalities. He's interested in the art, the artist, and the audience, creating a triple portraiture that enables a closer examination both of the work itself and also what its critical reception may reveal. Take, for instance, his New York Review of Books essay about the Beatles' mythology, which analyzes not only the meteoric rise of the pop band, but also its symbiotic relationship with the culture of the 60s, how the band's success was at once a product of its particular epoch as well as a bricolage of public perception. It is the myth of the Beatles O'Brien seems most interested in. To write about their music as panacea is to engage the belief that these musicians had the ability to, as he notes, create a world that is more companionable, where effortlessness began to seem a fundamental value, one that four young men who seemed more alive than their handlers and more known than their fans could produce. Crucially, the Beatles became characters in everyone's private drama, which meant the public began to feel ownership, as if the band owed a debt for having been placed in a position of odd and untenable centrality. At heart, O'Brien's essay is both an examination of the sometimes cannibalistic consumption of viewership and the differences and intersections between the men, the myth, and the music. Keen attention to context and culture is paramount to O'Brien's work. For him, culture exists in all forms, from the operatic to the pulp, the camp, and the pop. Culture, he writes, is not a wall over there, the very tiles of which your thoughts are constructed. He pays equal respect reviewing The Sopranos as he does La Traviata. No topic is too big or too small for him. In Hardboiled America, O'Brien covers not just the history, but also the evolution of the paperback book, the special focus on American crime fiction. In the Times Square story, he dips into fiction as he summons the glitz, glamour, and grime of 1950s Manhattan, with compulsive movie production as backdrop, and a narrator who seems to speak the disembodied consciousness of America. The entire book, in fact, is told through one single unending sentence, like a dream sequence enveloping the headiness of Times Square. Yet, just when one might assume O'Brien is most interested in the conceptual, he'll write something like The Fall of the House of Walworth, a rigorously researched, multi-generational Gothic about the Walworth family murder trial. But of course, in true O'Brien style, the book is also an examination of Gilded Age New York and social punctilio, as told through prose that invokes and evokes the conventions of Victorian horror story. A native of Long Island, O'Brien currently lives in Brooklyn. He's a longtime contributor to the New York Review of Books, in addition to countless other publications, including New York Times, The Village Voice, Bookforum, Harper's, Criterion Collection, and the New Republic. From 1982 to 2018, he served as the editor-in-chief of the Library of America, and has also been a faculty member of the writing program at the New School, a Whiting Award recipient, a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, a fellow for both the New York Institute of the Humanities and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, to name just a few of the many achievements. Tonight, we have the immense pleasure of hearing him speak. Please join me in welcoming the virtuoso, Geoffrey O'Brien, in conversation with equally brilliant Miss Harris.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
We never used to do this, but last year during the dark days of COVID and Zooming, I thought it would be nice for everybody to hear the actual writing of the person who was coming for a nonfiction dialogue. And Geoffrey has agreed graciously to do that this evening, so we're going to start off with a very brief reading from his work.
Okay, well, Liz suggested I read the opening, which is really a kind of preface to my most recent prose book, Where Did Poetry Come From? Some Early Encounters, which is a kind of memoir of bumping into poetry in some form, really from infancy. I mean, I start with nursery rhymes being recited and then moving through basically through adolescence. And then this was an attempt to kind of define the parameters of the book. What follows is not about wanting to be a poet or trying to become a poet or learning how to write or forgetting how to write and starting over or arguing about poetry, whether alone or with others, or attempting to come up with a valid general definition of poetry, or even a valid private definition that would not dissolve and change under pressure of constant, unavoidable revision, only to be set aside finally as an always provisional cluster of possibilities, tantalizing and radiant and unfinishable. It is not about making a close study of leaves or waves or constellations, or crouching to observe every species of natural transition and every corresponding trope of mythical transmutation, or surveying the approximately infinite techniques of poem writing across time and space, or mastering the 7,000 types of ambiguity and grammatical nuance, or delving to the root, the etymology of any given word, or naming and ordering the varieties of cadence, or pinpointing irreversible alterations in modes of expression, or savoring the internecine duels and denunciations of schools and sects, or speculating how and when poetry emerged in the timetable of human evolution, or in the formation of primeval tribes, or in the earliest inscribing of epics or love songs or healing incantations. The question here was only, where did poetry come from in a single random life? A question permanently open, like a vowel that finds no consonants to give it form and duration and direction. How did it make its presence known before it had been given a name? What could have suggested that such a thing existed? What kind of suggestions were stumbled upon, no matter how loosely or crudely understood, if understood at all, messily, partially apprehended in side views, or by getting words wrong, as when hearing a song on the radio, imposing new meanings on words or phrases by whim or compulsion? Through what fitful chance encounters did a notion, however blurred, form out of shivers, scratches, caresses, tremors and fits, intercepted repetitions, alluring patterns and curious views, voices unknown, even if intimately familiar people gave utterance to them, seasons of baffling incomprehension, experiences so unforgettable you are driven to make contact with them again, to discover you can make contact only by inventing them, as in a memoir where only what is quoted is certifiably authentic, the rest of it being a more or less fictional journey through accumulated fragments, a few strips of rag that dangle in the mind like weathered signposts, nudged into view by an aroma or breeze, what sticks and clicks in the night tunnel, insistent drum beats and hiccups, leading back to chamber or gulf or cave-like aperture or mad ancestor's attic, a spectral location disguised as memory of a first encounter. Where did poetry come from? And is it still there, continuing to spread outward beyond apprehending, continuing to escape in the sound always present and never altogether sounded, drifting up from beneath the temporary stopover where the hearer only perches, haunted like a house by what is overheard, a transience perpetually surviving. And then during this recent COVID era, this is the first time I've spoken to 5 people in many years. I divide my energies between writing poetry and writing nonfiction, which these days has mostly taken the form of articles for a variety of places, the New York Review of Books, the Criterion Collection, and others. And this, the COVID thing really has impressed even more than before this idea of writing as a sort of message in a bottle. I mean, you're in the cave and you're sending this out and you don't know where it's going to end up. And at the same time, you're listening for signals from outside. Now, I'm going to read just a few passages from a piece that was published in January of last year called Hitler in Antarctica. And this was a review of a book by the British historian Richard Evans, who is one of the great authorities on the Third Reich. And this particular book is kind of a marginal in terms of his work, which mostly is about what actually happened. I mean, this is a book about what didn't happen, and that large numbers of people insist did. And of course, I was doing the research for this in the midst of the build-up to the presidential election. So I would go from reading Evans on these various conspiracy theories and then reading the newspaper and finding a continuation of this narrative. So here's a little taste of this. Conspiracy theories can serve many functions. They may be tactical weapons wielded against political adversaries, or licenses for every form of revilement and victimization. They may be tools of induction into militant cadres or apocalyptic cults. They may offer seemingly reasoned justifications for already deeply held suspicions and animosities. They may provide entertainment in which any true believer can become an investigator, infiltrator, counter-conspirator, or, if committed enough, perhaps world savior. In the age of the internet, they continue to evolve into a proliferating and constantly mutating combination of scripture and adventure story, readily monetized by hucksters and proselytizers, able to incorporate any arbitrary detail, a reference to takeout pizza in a purloined email, say, and inflate it into a building block of a global plot. And then Evans talks about the origin of many such theories involving, for example, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the stab in the back theory of why Germany lost World War I, the burning of the Reichstag, and then he gets to the story of Rudolf Hess. And I was Rudolf Hess, who had at one time been one of the leaders in the Nazi Party, and who mysteriously flew to Scotland in May 1941 for reasons that were not clear to anybody at the time. Rudolf Hess's flight to Scotland in May 1941, he was anxious, he said, to meet with the Duke of Hamilton, to whom he attributed German sympathies. Was a mysterious event in its own time, but before reading Evans, I was not aware of what a body of arcane speculation it continues to generate. Hess, an early and intensely devoted Hitler loyalist, had been nudged aside within the Nazi leadership, a devotee of astrology and the occult who was described by his secretaries as confused and disoriented. He told the British that on his own authority he had undertaken to negotiate a peace settlement that would take Britain out of the war. Apparently under the impression that there existed a powerful faction of accusers within the UK government eager to make such a peace, he offered completely unacceptable terms. Held prisoner until the end of the war, he stood trial at Nuremberg and spent the rest of his life confined to Spandau prison in Berlin. Evans's account suggests the confusion created by Hess's defection. The Duke of Hamilton, baffled by the whole situation, was summoned to Churchill's country house and briefed him on what the Prime Minister called this funny story of yours. But further discussion was suspended while Churchill proceeded with a planned screening of a Marx Brothers film. Hitler, notified of Hess's flight, reacted, according to Albert Speer, with an inarticulate, almost animal outcry, and vowed that if he did make peace with Britain, it would be on condition that Hess be executed. British communists denounced the Duke of Hamilton as a quisling. Stalin, dining with Churchill at the Kremlin in 1944, proposed a toast to British intelligence for successfully luring Hess to Britain. The conviction that something much more complicated underlay Hess's flight, something involving Hitler or a dissident faction in the Nazi Party, or Churchill, or MI5, or a cabal of peace-minded English aristocrats, or a cabal pretending to be peace-minded English aristocrats, has provided material for a cottage industry of independent research. The tales get progressively wilder and often more deeply imbued with the most dubious ideological tendencies. Hess was an emissary of Hitler who sincerely sought peace. In rejecting Hitler's offer, Churchill was ultimately responsible for the Holocaust and the Cold War and the collapse of the British Empire. But then Churchill and the Allies were responsible for the war in the first place. Hess was poisoned in prison to make him mad. His suicide at the age of 93, the last prisoner in Spandau, was faked. He had been murdered by British intelligence to cover up his wartime dealings with British politicians who sought peace. He had been murdered to cover up what he knew about secret Nazi bases under Antarctica. He had been replaced by a double, and it was the double who crash-landed in Scotland and who died in Spandau. Just as, in a parallel narrative, Hitler would be replaced by the double whose remains were burned in Berlin, while the Führer and Eva Braun were whisked off to South America in a submarine. I heard that latter story on the playground too. In the Eisenhower era, it wasn't unusual for fifth graders to be swapping Hitler lore, no matter how far-fetched or off-base, and most of it was. Growing up after the war, we heard the fantasies and rumors before we learned any history. The fantasies and rumors, whether about Hitler or flying saucers or fluoridated water, continued to proliferate along the margins, a midden amounting to a parallel history, until in the late 1960s came a full flowering of the outlandish. By the early 1980s, we were awash in recovered memories of satanic child abuse that led to trials and convictions on the basis of what amounted to spectral evidence. And by the 1990s, heavily armed militias were scanning the skies for black helicopters heralding the New World Order. As conspiratorial fantasizing spreads more widely thanks to digital technology, taking ever more extreme forms as it travels, even the most casual onlooker might feel that there is indeed a conspiracy underway, nothing less than a worldwide conspiracy of conspiracy theorists. Whether motivated by cultic rapture, Machiavellian scheming, entrepreneurial zest, or the adrenaline of gaming. Perhaps it is a matter of surrendering out of discontented boredom to the pleasures of connecting dots, feasting on the Easter eggs planted as treats for diligent consumers of video games, and on the cryptic breadcrumbs laid out to provide hints for devotees of QAnon. Facts are confining and dispiriting. Fantasy is unbounded and exhilarating even when goaded on by dread. These are narratives of escape, even if they must culminate, as they so often do, in a dream of annihilation. And then,
Short.
okay. I'll just read a tiny bit just to get out of that world. But that actually led me into thinking about mythology, and I ended up writing a long piece about the Kalevala, which is the Finnish epic, which was more or less concocted in the 19th century out of surviving folk materials. And let's see. This is just to give a little bit of the flavor of the Kalevala. The superimposed zones of the Kalevala occupy a common ground, a space that toggles between the real and the mythic. It is a geography defined by watery pathways and watery fates. The maiden Ainau drowns herself and is transformed into a fish. Lemminkainen's boat is trapped by supernaturally invoked ice. Wainamoinen is wounded by a jealous rival and left to drift on the water like a fallen fur log, like a hollow pine stump. Often a marshy, damp, and chill pervades. The various states of water and their uncertain transitions from freshets to slush, from whirlpools to slack water, are called upon to character our states of mind. Everything continually changes. Waterways ice over, wood rots, and beyond the known waters is the river of death in the land of Tuanella, where each of the three heroes in turn will be sent on a quest, in each case barely surviving. The sheer difficulty of continuing to exist is repeatedly stressed, notably by the wounded Wainamoinen as he drifts helplessly into the unknown. Now I do not even know how to live or how survive. Must I make my home in the wind, build my walls upon the water? All journeys are uncertain, and even the wisest acknowledge the profound unease of departing toward lands where only the wind is known to me.
Thanks very much. Well, you can see just from that short reading the range of Geoffrey's interests. He has published 8 books of poetry and I believe 10 other books of around there somewhere.
That sounds
You
about
can never
right.
say that about him because once you enunciate it, if you wake up the next morning over your orange juice, you may find another book.
Well, there is another one coming.
Is there? What's it about?
It's about the early 30s in America as filtered through the movies that were being made between about 1929 and 1934, before the production code came into full force. And it's called Arabian Knights of 1934. It should be out a year from now, more or less. So,
And this is different from Phantom Empire, which is also about movies and
Yeah.
the 20th century.
it's different in form. I mean, this is, it's this thing of, we're talking about nonfiction, and I wouldn't, this new one, I wouldn't know how to define it as being either fiction or nonfiction, because it's a collage of elements which are real for the most part, but they're mixed together in a form that I suppose makes it fiction, but in fact, I would say about 85% of the book is actual stories, actual images, actual lines from movies. So it's a sort of mosaic of the period.
I think you'd be hard pressed looking at any of your books, really, to say, even if you didn't know you were a poet, to say that this is like made of the notable sign points of the genre. I mean, the language of all Geoffrey's books is so clean. When he talks about the most complicated subjects, you feel that a poet has written the sentence, even if he's talking about a quart of milk or whatever it is. And it's one of the joys of it. As I was saying to him earlier, he's one of the few people I've read where even when I disagree with him, for example, I disagree with you about Quentin Tarantino, you are very, you honor him, and I hate this sort of aesthetic violence.
I definitely have my problems with Quentin Tarantino.
Oh, you do?
Oh, yeah.
I can see them.
If you've seen my review of Django Unchained, you would have seen
I will look at that. But
no, what happened with Tarantino is that people kept asking me to review his movies. And I was initially impressed. I mean, somebody called me up and said, "There's this movie opening, Pulp Fiction, and can you go and see it and then give me the review tomorrow?" So I went and saw the movie and I was impressed, and I wrote, I felt like a real movie critic. I have to write this overnight. And then, I ended up writing about Kill Bill and then Django Unchained, and my enthusiasm has waned as,
good for
but
when you
leaving Django ran out of it, but that's
right. But when the subtitle of Phantom Empire, the movies of the mind, where you say the subtitle is movies in the mind of the 20th century, that gives us a hint about what you're writing about all the time. Few people would have that word in mind about a whole culture.
Well, I confess, I did not come up with that something.
But
My editor, Jerry Coward.
But he's right. It is that. It is that. I mean, it's not right. It's not conventional. Just conventional writing about films. You're a cultural historian, but you're writing like a poet, no matter what you're writing about.
Early on, I was thinking about the term that the French historians were using a lot, mentalities. I mean, to try to chart, okay, you're talking about, you're staking out a certain area, and when I wrote about the 60s, I really was trying to write about what was in people's minds at the time, not to describe what they were doing, but what they were thinking about what they were doing. And when I wrote about music in Sonata Jukebox, because I'm not a musician, and I'm incapable of actually describing the music in that way, I was trying to describe, again, what these records represent for and how they use them, and what, their place almost as like ritual objects in life. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that, and, the new book is very much that. It's very much how do people construct an image of the world. I'm thinking of teenagers in, say, 1933, going to the movies, and how are they constructing an image of the world out of the content of these movies?
Speaking of which, the last time I met you, you told me about you grew up in a suburb of Long Island,
Yes.
and you regularly went into the 42nd Street movies.
Yes.
And I asked you, your parents let you do that?
Well, I was older.
You were 15.
I was 15.
Okay, I remember that.
Yeah.
Well, the 42nd Street, this was before the high sleeves.
Yeah, no, you have to distinguish, yeah.
Yes,
I mean, it
that's
got
true.
much sleazier.
But still, who was in the audience beside you? There were guys with paper bags, right?
Yeah, it was like a lot of people just sleeping it off.
Right.
And, it was the cheapest seat in town,
And what were the sort of movies you were seeing?
Westerns. There was one theater that only showed westerns.
Right.
A lot of adventure movies, comedies with Jerry Lewis, Italian science fiction movies, like that.
Not high art.
Well, I consider it. A lot of it I still do. It's
Right.
high art,
But your interest seems to have been from your books, looking at what the culture represents on the surface. Americans believe themselves to be lucky, happy, all the things that we know about post-war years. And especially Hardboiled America is so delightful in its plumbing of what was under that thin crust of self-love and we're having a wonderful time.
But that was also on the surface. I mean, even for me as a kid, you go into a drugstore and there are all those paperbacks on the rack. And,
Right.
I wasn't reading those books then, but just the covers were definitely suggested another world.
But a world that wasn't sort of advertised that much except for that rack, right? The world of general television.
Or the world of even, movie posters for some movies.
Right.
And then, of course, if you're talking about the 30s, early 30s movies can be quite grim.
You do say that they represent something like a 20th century equivalent of Currier and Ives, in the sense that they're emblematic of the culture.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I'm always looking for something like that. Where are the pictures of that this particular moment makes of itself? And there's always more, you know, there are always different sides to it.
As a teenager, were you made aware in movies of the nuclear threat, or was that coming later?
Well, On the Beach came out in, I think, 1956, 57? Or no, maybe 58. But that was, I don't know, I saw that. I saw that with an adult who was weeping uncontrollably at the end of the movie, and I was trying to comfort her. I was 10 years old. Like, it's okay. Don't worry.
But those years are famous for the placid surface of things, and that is not the world you're describing in the paperbacks.
Well, yeah, I guess I was more aware. I mean, you know, my father was in the radio business, and that had its rough edges, and so I got some sense of that. And, you know, and my older brother was into jazz and, you know, the music world, which also had its rough edges. So, yeah, I mean, I guess I was getting some input just in the family that was not, you know, it was not living fever, you know.
The most lyrical of your imaginings about that subject, I think, is Dream Time, where you're hovering into the 60s in that same way. And it's not a report on the 60s, it's a report on the emotions of the 60s more.
Yeah, and well, that was one that I really wanted to do when I became aware of the fact that that era was very rapidly receding, and that my own memory was changing because my life had changed so much since then.
Right.
So I really wanted to get all of that down while I could still close my eyes and vividly recall everything. I could never possibly have written that book, you know, 20 years later. It was I had to do it then when everything was still very, very fresh in recollection, and at the same time, the world had changed enough so that the contrast was already apparent. I mean, I started writing that in the early 80s.
Right.
So this is, post-Reagan, and it was clear that, yeah, we're not, we're moving into a different moment here.
You could say that.
Yeah.
I was always struck because of what the 20s were, how much more real change. We think of the 60s as changing everything and nothing before that being so radical, but I think the 20s were more radical for women particularly.
Oh, yeah.
And the people of the 60s think they were inventing change and that it was so different, but I think, and my mother was a lawyer, she became a lawyer in the 20s, and that was almost impossible. And people got the vote, and a lot of things really happened, whereas in the 60s there was a lot of charm and fuss. Oh, I'm forgetting a wonderful essay on the Beatles. Could you talk a little bit about that? It's the greatest.
Oh, well, thank you. I was working already, or thinking about the book that I wrote about pop music, Sonata for Jukebox. So and I had mentioned this to Bob Silver at the review, so books come along in that area, I would love to review them, and then this Beatles anthology, which was CDs, and also this big book was published, and so I took the opportunity, first of all, to listen to all their music, which I hadn't done in a long time, and just that was just a question of really trying to stand back, and because that was I was like in the 10th grade when the Beatles came on the scene, that very quickly changed everything as far as people's relationship to music.
Everybody's, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, not that people weren't listening to music. I certainly knew people who were listening to music, but then everybody was listening to music. It was just, including, you know, my parents' generation. I mean, one of my great shocks was, you know, to go downstairs and there was my parents and their friends listening to Rubber Soul and savoring it and talking about how great it was. So that was a change. And then, you know, in retrospect, I was so struck with the fact that, well, all of that was such a short period of time, you know, 7 years. You know, that takes on the quality of some endless moment. And yeah, it's 7 years.
But there was such a phenomenon for the whole culture.
Well, and still.
I was in the Plaza Hotel on their birthday when they were doing their concert. They were staying at the Plaza Hotel. They were doing a concert around the corner at Carnegie Hall. Do you remember that? One of their first concerts. And we were sitting there at the Palm Court. And I was sitting with an aunt of mine. And they came through, and all the old ladies in their velvet dresses practically tripped over themselves to get a glimpse of the Beatles. It was a great, great moment. I think we should open this up to
Sure.
questions
Sure.
if people have them. If you do, now is the time. Any questions?
Yes. I was wondering how, like, if over time the way you view movies critically has changed, or that's kind of remained stagnant sense of.
Wait, sorry, the way
Way you are like reviewing movies and how you watch them, if you're like critically watching them, has that like changed over time? Or?
well, yeah, I mean, it changes, but I think almost by, you know, in small increments. I mean, in other words, I didn't start writing criticism and I didn't start writing prose really on any scale until, you know, I was maybe 28. And then up until that time, you know, I was full of opinions, and everyone was, and you know, life was a series of very animated conversations about movies, about music. But then, you know, you start writing, and then immediately it's a different thing. I mean, you say, okay, I think this is great. Why do I think it's great? And then you're doing it steadily over decades, and the reasons change, and what you're looking at changes. And I mean, with movies, when I was just starting out, I was very influenced by Andrew Sarris and The Village Voice, and followed almost religiously his sense of who were the great directors, or the overrated directors, and yeah, I feel now, I mean, I look at movies in a very different way. I'm looking at the film as a place where so much is going on, involving so many people and so many circumstances, which, you know, doesn't in any way deny the artistry of a director or of anyone, but it brings in so many other things as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think that is what changes, really, hopefully that's what changes, that you simply are more aware of what's going on, you know, and not sort of reducing it to a simple, you know, thumbs up, thumbs down thing. I mean, yeah, really, I mean, I find now the opinions, is it good, is it bad, mean very little to me, and I'm sort of amazed on social media. I see people, you know, people that I respect, you know, kind of having these endless arguments about, you know, who's up, who's down, you know, do I give it 3 stars or no stars, or, you know, I mean, it just seems a real waste of time. I mean, it's more interesting simply to talk about something and see what you can find there.
Well, culture and politics are a competitive game in this country, aren't they? Yeah. I meant to ask you this because our students are always interested in this, and I'm so interested in what you were reading, I forgot. How did you get your start as a writer? You have to answer that.
Well, I always had thought about it. I mean, I wrote a lot when I was a kid. I mean, just inane things. And then, but when I was in my 20s, I wrote poetry exclusively and not very successfully. And it really, I mean, it was a kind of really circuitous process and it was really finally, the Hardboiled America was, because my life was in a certain amount of disarray, and my writing was, in even more disarray. And I was determined to write a book. And I was like, okay, what am I going to do? And meanwhile, I had this collection of those paperbacks, because I was living in the East Village, and they were still these little stores with the paperbacks every time I saw them when I was there. And originally I was just, I'm just going to do an art, it's just going to be these images with captions, and I took it to an editor and said, no, you have to write text to go with the images. So I ended up writing that book to be the text to go with the images, and I was fortunate enough to have a friend who worked for Nostrand Reinhold and was able to sell them on the idea of doing it as a book. I mean,
no agent.
I did finally. No, actually, the agent was. No, I did have an agent finally on that book, just to handle the contract and everything. But the actual the sale was just made. My friend was able very persuasively to sell them on the idea of doing the book. And then after that, I started writing for the Village Voice.
What years are you talking about?
Well, I think the first piece I did for the Voice was in '82, and then all through the '80s, I was writing for them.
A lot of people started there.
Oh, it was a great thing because VLS had just started. Memoir.
I preceded Memoir. I was their first literary editor in the '70s. This is old history. Now, our mutual friend Luke's son, now Lucy's son, told me that a lot of the writers for the New York Review had served as interns. Were you such a person?
No, I was not. But I was working for Jason Epstein.
So yes.
I mean,
not an intern.
Who just left us. I mean, this was no Jason. He got me started in show business. I mean, he called me up out of the blue, and interviewed me to edit a thing called the Reader's Catalog, and gave me the job. This massive telephone book size thing that was supposed to be a kind of LL Bean catalog for buying books over the phone. And then this turned into a job that lasted a good number of years. And unfortunately, this was just before Amazon, and just before the internet, and just before a lot of things. So it did not take flight. The book itself was a lot of fun to do,
but you're confirming what Luke told me in a way that they embrace their own.
Yeah, well, Reader's Catalog was on the same floor as in the Fisk building as the New York Review.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of back and forth, and a lot of review people were also involved with the Reader's Catalog, and there was also the Reader's Subscription, which was Jason's answer to the Book of the Month Club. So it was all, a very busy hive of, but yeah, I mean, the number of people who were in and out of that floor was pretty striking, I mean, I remember, going up in the elevator, and it was like, oh, this is Bruce Chapman. I was like, that, you know. And this was mid-'80s, you know, and before that, I didn't know from that world, like, at all, the midtown world of real publishing. I knew the poet world below 14th Street, poetry readings, and, you know. So it was a kind of a sea change. And then, of course, that in turn led to the Library of America, because Jason was also one of the founders of the Library of America, and he was chairman of the board, and so on and so forth.
This is not a path our students can follow.
Well, it was a convergence of things.
I understand.
You know.
We all have our stories from those days. Mine is sort of like that too, but I won't tell them because it's the same thing. It's not going to happen like today.
Well, you know, yeah. I mean, I think about this a lot. I mean, the things that people did. I mean, when you read about the fact that, say, you know, Elizabeth Hardwick was like working as an editor for some of those sleazy paper publishers.
Right.
And Patricia Highsmith was writing comic books.
Right.
You know, side by side with Mickey Spillane. I mean,
did you know any of the magazine management people? That was another source. Patty Bosworth used to work for them. They made up everything in the magazines. There wasn't a word of truth in the magazine at the time, and they weren't expected to have to be true. Any other questions? Mr. Professor Locate?
I'm curious about your sentences, those lacking in the sentences scoop up everything, you know?
I do like to do that, yeah.
What do you think that comes from? What do you think you're trying to do with those sentences?
I don't know. I mean, I even, well, you know, Times Square Story is all one sentence, and I wrote a 1,000-line poem that's all one sentence, and Browser's Ecstasy has like a 20-page section that's all one sentence. So it was a phase, maybe, I don't know. But I do like to draw, well, I mean, it used to be, I don't know, I mean, Dickens has some awfully long sentences.
No, I love that.
No one's complaining.
I'm just wondering if the clauses are trying to cancel each other out like a lot of rubble or something like that, you know? Or if there's an accumulation of what you're trying to get at.
I guess the sense of, you know, the totality being this somewhat overwhelming combination of things coming at you. In other words, the moments when you're not perceiving isolated phenomena, but you're getting more the whole spectrum all at once, and trying to take that in, you know, which is something I guess I associate with sort of threshold moments when you're just coming into some reality that's unfamiliar to you. So you're seeing it all at once, and then later I mean, something that I imagine, I mean, when I think of infancy, you know, what that is for an infant to be suddenly, to emerge into the world of total stimulation, total activity. I mean, my grandson just turned 2, so I've been observing this. I mean, and reminded again what that is, and what that must be. I mean, it's so sometimes I am trying to actually recreate my imagination. I mean, this book has a long thing at the beginning that really is trying to imagine being an infant, having adults recite words that are not understood, or that little by little pieces of it are understood. I mean, something that, you know, I mean, that's something that interests me, because it seems to me in education now, and for a long time, there's a tendency to kind of say, well, you know, this kid is not ready for this, you know, this is for later, you know, give them something that they can understand. Whereas I think the exact opposite. I mean, I think it's good to be exposed to things that you don't understand. And I mean, I feel like when I was a kid, because I was surrounded by adults and older brothers who were, you know, whether harmonic school or not, I'm hearing it. I'm hearing, you know, my father and my older brother Bob were into Gilbert and Sullivan, so by the time I was 10, I, you know, knew every word of these without understanding. I mean, and now I'll suddenly get a flash on a Gilbert and Sullivan lyric and think, well, that's what that is. I mean, it's just, oh, yeah. You know, but it's all in there, you know. I mean, and I don't see the harm in that, far from it. I mean, the same with Shakespeare. I mean, I got into Shakespeare, but through comic books, you know, because there were classic comics then, and you know, Hamlet, Macbeth, you know, and you know, the earliest thing I remember from Hamlet is like, you know, how now, rat, you know, and the very simple, the monosyllabic passages, and usually associated with some violent action, and that came through, and then, you know, the rest later on. But I don't know, that really interests me. I mean, the idea that you absorb something without understanding it, but you have absorbed it, and then, you know, maybe a very long time before, you know, it's like the time release capsule.
Well, if there are no more questions, we're so grateful that you could come. Thank you very